Hey everyone. Yes, I hope you're all awake. So thanks for having me, the organizers, first of all. I also wanted to appreciate the place that we are at right now and the acoustics. It's great. I want to play some music. Yes, so I'm Damián and I'm going to be talking about platformizing features and how we do that at Spotify. I'm going to give two examples of different features that we refactored to make them more easily extensible. In the end, we're going to have some time for Q&A as well. But first, if this works, yes, a little bit about me, as they told already. I'm actually originally from Argentina. You might have guessed because of my accent. I'm from a city a bit south of here where we're now, which is called Quilmes, the place where they make the beer. Fun fact, when I went to high school as a teenager, I could smell the malt in the air. And I didn't notice that it was the beer until later when I tried it. Yeah, it's about 16 kilometers, 10 miles, 30 minutes by car. But around 6 years ago, I decided to make a change. And I moved to this also beautiful place called Stockholm in Sweden, where I live somewhere over there, maybe a bit farther than that. And the main reason I moved there is to work at Spotify and joined an amazing group of engineers, of which you will hear from two others here about testing at scale. So yeah, stay for the next talk as well. So to give a little bit of context first, because I think both theirs and my talk are a little bit about scale as well. So just to give context of where we are at Spotify, we're a bunch of employees, like 10,000 or more. We have a lot of monthly active users, 450 million and counting. Our music app, the one that I'm going to be talking about today, has more than 1.5 million lines of code. I checked and we have around 1,000 commits per week. And also, interestingly, the oldest one is like 14 years ago, someone pushing a lot of code in it from somewhere else, in Perforce or SVN or somewhere, which is pretty interesting. When you go into this code base, you're going to find a lot of cool and new stuff, and also some legacy stuff as well. But now about the topic of the talk. Yes, I want to talk about a feature-specific one that you see here. So at Spotify, we love music. You might have known about it, perhaps. And this is the one that users see when they want to know more about what you're listening to, for example. We call it the Now Playing view, and you can go there and you can pause, skip next, previews, context menus. You see the cover art, or in this case, it's a short video that you see in the background. But we had a problem with this view back in the day. This view had many different configurations and many different types of UI. Maybe you won't notice. I will go into the details on some of these. But they're slightly different, each of them. Some of them are very different. For example, this one is like landscape video. And others like this, they show music and talk. And so we include music into our podcasts as well, and you can go and find a specific song inside this specific episode. And much more than that. So what happened here? The team that owned this feature, my team back in the day, we were having issues dealing with all of this. You can already maybe see, some of you have experience with this already, of course, that this could be a problem for testability when you have everything in the same feature, in the same module. Not just for testability, but also different teams wanted to extend this experience. And they were taking a long time to do so because they were kind of blocked by the owning team of the feature. It was complicated to understand where things had to happen. And overall support for the team went pretty high. Our team was spending maybe 30% of our time supporting other teams when we should have been, in fact, actually developing new and cool features for our users. Cool, so how did we solve that? It was an interesting problem because it's a pretty big feature in our systems. I think I'm going to talk about two steps that we took in order to solve it. The first one is about that we split it into reusable components, and the second one is about modes. So let's try to dive a bit into it. Here you can see an example of what we did with our page. When it used to be kind of like a monolith, and the page used to like kind of instantiate and have business logic for each of these UI elements, components, or whatever you want to call them. Right here, we split it into kind of individual elements. So each of these is a standalone UI component that can execute the business logic that it needs to. So for example, the play button that you see there, that is the only one that doesn't move. The play button, you can put it anywhere in the app, and it's going to behave as a now playing play button. And that means that when you tap it, it's going to play whatever context the user is on. And if you pause it, it's going to pause it. And it's going to do a bunch of other things as well. So that's what we mean by standalone. And this is one example of how we split it into components. But this is only one step, because with that componentization, you might wonder, well, how did you solve the issue of collaborating and having too much time on support for teams? Well, the second step is about modes. Mode is basically a configuration. What we decided is that each of these screens that I showed you, kind of, was going to be represented by a different configuration or mode. So we made up a bunch of these, like music, podcast, video, ads, etc. So how does this work? I want to give an example because that will make it much easier to explain. In this example, you can see on the left, there's a track, now playing view, where you can listen to normal tracks, music tracks, let's say, and on the right, there's a podcast episode. And the views are different, but I want to see this. I want to focus on this specific difference, which has to do with the buttons, the control buttons that we call them. On the left, the user can skip to the next track and skip to the previous track. But for podcasts, users prefer actually, to skip 15 seconds forwards and back, and also do other things. So the question is, how can we enable a team to go from the left to the right without having to really be supported by the team who owns the experience on the left? And here's how we can put the puzzle all together using modes and reusable components. So the first thing that team can do in order to do this is to register a new mode. You guessed it probably, it's a podcast mode. So when they register a mode, what they're saying is that I'm going to be providing a full screen experience when the users tap the now playing view. So basically what they can do is they can leave a white page where nothing happens, and that's going to be their podcast mode. But that's pretty lame, let's say, and not really useful for our users. So what they do is also they reuse our components. Easy, right? You go in and you take the context menu component that is already standalone, and you just put it on the screen. And you do the same with every other of the components that you want to reuse, and you put them on the screen. So now you build the same thing, but then you want to change some of this behavior, and here's when you can add your own custom components, of course. So instead of putting on the screen the skip to next button and skip to previous button, you create now your private podcast skip component, which actually skips 15 seconds next and 15 seconds back. Of course, in order to lay them out on the page as a feature, we need some sort of template, and we have that too, so that you don't need to go and rebuild that as well. And once you did that, you're done. For the type of podcast entity, you will be asked to provide a full screen experience where you're reusing a lot of standalone components, you're changing a couple of them, you're putting them in a template, and then we show that to the user. The now playing platform, which is the thing that we changed from a feature to a platform, is the one that manages all of that and shows it to the user. Of course, as people said here before, if you want to improve something, you have to measure it. We agree. We did measure, for example, the impact on the developer experience with service. We also measured our support as a team to see if it had actually decreased or increased. We also improved that. And we, as a matter of fact, also enabled a bunch of new experiences. For example, recently released audiobooks use this technique as well, which is great. It means the teams can customize the Now Playing experience without being blocked by anyone. So taking a little bit of a step back, I wanted to really think about why this worked, because I think that when we did this as a team, we did it kind of like intuitively, let's say. We just thought this was kind of correct to not have to support the teams. But I think there are some tools in our tool belt as engineers and developers that can help us move forward and can also maybe help you. And I think I want to relate this a little bit to Solid, and I'm going to try to remember every one of these. But yeah, Solid is an acronym for object-oriented programming, but I think it can be extended to other things as single responsibility, open-close principles, list cost substitution, interface segregation, and dependency inversion. There, I got it. I'm going to talk about 3 of them that I think we can relate to what we just did with the platform. The first one is open-closed. This principle says that, I think it's about classes, that a class should be open for extension but closed for modification, meaning that you don't want people to go in and just change the code. You want people to compose it or use inheritance or some other tool like that. In our case, I think we did that, but on a bigger scale with a platform, saying that instead of coming in and modifying our feature and doing if-oriented programming and saying, if this is a podcast, then show this button, we opened it for extension and closed it for modification. We created a platform in which you can register a mode and change some buttons, and that makes it extensible. The second one is interesting too, it's about dependency inversion. If you think about it, originally in the problem that I showed you at the beginning, the Now Playing feature as a feature kind of, so the Now Playing feature knew about podcasts, the Now Playing feature knew about videos, the Now Playing feature knew about ads. There's an arrow of dependency going from the feature towards these specific content types. By building this platform, we reversed this dependency. We made it so that now a podcast experience team is the one who is registering the mode and providing the view and reusing some of these components. So now podcast depends on Now Playing feature. Now video depends on Now Playing feature. That way we reversed the dependency and greatly simplified the platform. And the last one is also a bit of a stretch, but it's like single responsibility by componentizing the feature and making it so that each component is standalone. We made it much easier to handle because now each component is pretty simple, doesn't have a lot of state, and can be reused very easily. The second example that I wanted to give very quickly, and I think I'm good on time, is about, again, in this case, it's a podcast, but it's no longer the Now Playing view. We call it the podcast show page. It's for the podcasts. So after some years of the experience with the Now Playing view, we found that we had a similar problem with this page that you're seeing right now. Different teams wanted to add things as podcasts became very popular around the world. They wanted to add things like ratings or categories, different features inside of it. But of course, we had the same original problem as in the Now Playing view. So what we did was pretty simple. We applied kind of like the same concept, but of course different. In this case, we actually split it into a bit of bigger components because it was much harder to split it per button, for example. So far, this is what you will have, these vertical or horizontal split components. It's like a header, description, the title for the episode rows, and the episodes. All of those are single components that can be reused anywhere and are completely standalone. We call this PEPAR, which means Podcast Episode Pages Architecture. It's a catchy name, and this allows you do things like injecting that component in between there for ratings and categories. But this is a bit different, and you might notice it here, and I want to give a bit of a shout out to a tool that we built at Spotify. So in that show page that I'm going to go back maybe, yeah. In this show page, it's way more complex than what we saw in the now playing view. So each of these, not the page itself necessarily, but each component holds quite a lot of state. If you take a look at, for example, the episode row at the bottom there, it has save, download, share, play, and pause. And it can also do a bunch of other things. It shows the current playback state, etc. So yes, here's where we actually use this. And this is a tool that we developed also quite a few years ago. It's called Mobius, and it allows you to manage state. It's a bit similar to Redux for the ones that use that, also inspired in Elm, of which I know almost nothing about. And it's very lightweight, and we love it. We used it for each component. So all of those components that I showed you before, the ones that are complex enough, they use this to manage its state. And a bit more about it. So the tool is a unidirectional state management tool that is based on the idea that you want to have pure functions to change your state, and you want your state to be immutable if possible. So the tool allows you to do that by providing or making you provide an update function which takes a model and an event. An event can be something like user tapped play, and that update function will produce a new model. It's a pure function. This new model will probably be something like, okay, now the episode is playing, and it can also produce effects. An effect could be, it's actually called the player, and let's start playback. So effect land is the land that we don't like. It's the impure land that is not so easily testable, and it's all the things that you can see at the bottom here. So this architecture, yes, is also unidirectional, and it allows you to test it very easily because of using pure functions. It avoids race conditions because of having an immutable model. Yeah, and it helps us quite a lot for the podcast pages. Yes, I think I'm going to start closing here. So what did we learn with all of these things we did? Well, we really liked Solid. We need to take more inspiration in it and apply it even more, probably. We also learned that we really need to manage our state. That was something we were not really very conscious of. We were using like model BV model or MVP for Android. And that was maybe a bit chaotic in the view models, for example. A lot of state going back and forth, a lot of side effects being thrown around. It wasn't easy to debug, it wasn't easy to test, it wasn't easy to understand either. And last but not least, I also recommend, and this is something that we do as well a lot, is start small. Try to iterate. The things that I showed here can be a bit complex, but it's good to start from something that you think adds value. Try it, measure it, like was said, and then keep going, instead of going all in and trying to build a platform for a random feature. Yeah, thanks for the time. I think we have Q&A time now.
Cool. Congrats on the talk. We have some questions here. We have an anonymous question saying, do you design the architecture of these components for both Android and iOS, or does they, Android, have their own design?
Yeah, that's a very cool question. We would like for them to be exactly the same. Honestly, they're not exactly the same, but they do follow the same principles. For example, when I talked about the now playing view, yes, there is modes in both platforms. There is a way to register modes in both platforms. The details of what the components are a bit different. But yes, we would love them to be the same, and in a lot of cases they are quite similar, especially because of I think it's a very interesting question because of the stakeholders we have inside the company, the people that use our platform, the other engineers, when they want to do something, they don't expect the both platforms to actually work in a different way, of course, and that's a bit of a problem when it happens. So you do want your APIs to be as similar as possible, but it's always a challenge, to be honest.
Okay. Okay, so Ever Uribe asks, who defines the components? Or do you have a company wiki or something to keep track of the components' names?
Good one. Yeah, I will label that visibility. I think we're probably a bit bad with that. We can always improve. The person who defines the component or the team that defines the components and what they are and how to split it is the owning team. There's a team that owns the platform, and those are the ones who are going to decide, okay, is this a mode? Is this not a mode? Is this a component or not a component? Yeah.
Okay. So, Gio asks, when you mention creating components, does the logic of what the component does is part of it, or was it purely a UI element?
Good one, yes. The logic is definitely part of what the component does. That's why we call them standalone, and that's why you can easily reuse them. Because, yes, you can also inject the logic by fetching it from somewhere else. You can get the UI and then tell it, okay, this is your view model or whatever you want it to be, and you pass it on to. But we do believe that for us, it's very important to simplify the work from other teams to make these components as easily pluggable as possible. So that means that a team can create a new Now Playing view experience, for example, which is the same as the current one, with very little effort in less than 30 minutes or an hour, and then they can go on, customize it, and change it to do what they want to do. But the basic should be as simple as possible, not complicated, and all of that.
Okay. So, Marcelo Busico asks, you mentioned there are less dependencies because of the usage of the reusable components. What do you do when a new component is needed that blocks developers?
A new component needed. So I think it might depend on the component. So here, I didn't go into detail, but of course, I think the platform provides two things. Provides an API in which you can register a mode, and provides this list of components, which we call them the default ones. So a play button is a component that, for example, the Now Playing platform team will own, and the rest of them too. Now, if there is a need for a new component, then it's very likely that it could be the case that this other team, for example, the podcast one, could own it by themselves. They can create it, they can use it, or whatever. At some point, it could be the case also, and maybe that's what the question is implying, that some of these new components are used in many different Now Playing views, modes, let's say, and they need to be reused there. So that's also a possibility, but of course it needs some communication with the team and understanding, is this actually valuable for us to own it or not? Specifically, I don't know if you have this kind of work in your companies, but a team that owns the Now Playing platform usually tries to own as very little things as possible. So their first answer will be like, no, we don't want to own your new button. You go, do it, have fun. And only when there's a really important case made for it that we need some sort of UX consistency or some other issue that we're trying to solve. In that case, maybe we will agree to own it. Yeah.
Okay. So another anonymous question. Mobius seems similar to the open source library created by Point3, the composable architecture. Have you heard about it?
No, not myself. No, I implied also like Redux, Elm. I know that the team that built Mobius was really into understanding all of those other architectures that we could use for similar cases. And there's some cool investigations and trying to understand what are the pros and cons. But yeah, this is just another one, and I recommend it if you want to give it a try.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you mind if we go some more questions?
Sure.
Okay, cool.
I have all day.
Okay. So Pedro asked, first of all, he says, great talk.
Thanks.
You mentioned about developer experience improvement. Could you talk a little bit on how you did manage to measure the improvement?
Yes, great one. Good. Paying attention, people. Good.
For us, yes.
Yes. So this is a hard one. We would love it for there to be a computer that can measure experience and maybe measures your heart rate whenever you're trying to develop a feature, or measures the amount of times that you say some curse word. I'm not going to say it for politeness. Every time you're trying to do something with someone else's feature. But honestly, the way that we can actually measure this realistically is by survey. And yes, the same way that people can do user research for a feature, like a final user-facing feature, you can also do user research for your engineers, for other teams that are using the platform. So that's what we do. We can do surveys, we can do interviews, etc., gather some data, and try to correlate and compare versus what it was in the past to what it is now. It's not easy, but it kind of works.
Okay. Are the components made programmatically, or are you using storyboards or something like that?
No, programmatic all the way, of course, yeah.
Are you part of an infrastructure team or a feature team that happens to own the architecture? How do you handle supporting other teams?
That's a very good question. I love it that people are paying so much attention. Even after lunch, oh my God.
Yeah.
I feel bad now, I'm a bit sleepy. Yes, I think that's a great question. I think, so in paper, if you ask those guys over there who are going to speak now, they're going to say that no, we're not part of a platform team. We're not inside the platform mission. I think it's a bit controversial what I'm going to say. I think that eventually some of these teams could step a bit closer to platform. But of course, we're sitting more into owning UIs and owning those sort of things that are not very common for specific platform teams. And it is true that it's mostly a team that owned a feature that eventually found itself owning a platform. But yeah, hopefully it will change. Maybe I can change some minds around Spotify and make it so. Yeah.
Okay, and the last one. There is any drawbacks that you have found in the architecture?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, one example I'll give. I'm sure there's many if I think about them, but in the one that I showed about the show page, that is a bit more complex. So the difference between the now playing view and the show page is that the now playing view doesn't really fetch that much data from the network. All the data that is there is already there. The show page acts a bit differently, and there's some data loading depending on what you're seeing. For example, we have a live component that shows when an episode has the opportunity to be also a live experience. We show it there, and it can also be updated. So making the components completely standalone brings a bit of issues there in the data loading, because it could be the case that some components do load data, others don't, and you lose a bit of track there. So yes, that's a good one, and we are working on the next iteration of this, which might be next Festival. I can tell you about it.
Nice. Thank you so much.